I took a look at the 50 routes that are currently suspended. And I know that when they originally did the work around deciding what order they were going to try to restore the routes and which routes were going to be suspended, they had applied equity tiering to that. And so the last bit of the 50 routes, from what I could see, and they did confirm it with data, that it was low. It didn't have a lot of students that were furthest from educational justice that were directly impacted by the suspended routes. So I asked if that was one option. Another option was I asked them to look at some ideas that were originally identified in a previous transportation audit. I think the year of the audit was 2019. Some of the recommendations from that transportation audit were to plan bus routes around students who are opting in to bus ridership versus just the universe of eligible riders. That was one idea that I asked them to assess. I also asked them questions about the timing around 1 hour between the different start times. And I wondered if there was a possibility of splitting elementary schools into 2 tiers, so that because most of the routes are for elementary school students and special education students that have in their IEP, and most of our general education high school students are taking public transit to school at this point. So I wondered if that was one way to address the bus driver shortage issue, to make more of a, maintain the 2-tier system and just focus the routes on elementary schools. So from my perspective, I can't say that I got very clear answers on why those were not viable options. And I will just leave it at that.
Thanks. And Director Hampson?
Oh, sorry. Are we each answering the same question?
Yeah, if you have something that you want to contribute. I just want to give the space for each person.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going, just having one director. I misunderstood your instructions. Okay. So I don't want to duplicate anything that Director Song-Moritz stated. I do want to be clear that the factually speaking, and my position on this remains that this is not a board decision. This is an operational decision. It's not required by policy that the board approve bell times. And my greater interest is in the student, the transportation eligibility plan, which we haven't actually spent a lot of time talking about, and I think is probably where the crux of the these issues are. And so what we have been presented from my perspective in terms of data is that the driver shortage, right? It's not, no money isn't going to solve that problem because the drivers aren't there. And this is a nationwide crisis, and we've certainly been subject to it. There have been a number of different, kind of configurations like Director Song-Moritz that has talked about in terms of things that have brought up in terms of opt-in models, and why those work or don't work, optimization of stops and routes, and consolidation of that, and whether or not that would provide the necessary ability to have, with the same number of drivers, right, meet all the transportation need based on eligibility, and still keep everything within an 8 to 9 o'clock timeframe, or at least maybe within 10 minutes, right, of that 8 to 9 timeframe. I don't think there's any disagreement that that's the right time for kids to go to school. No, I don't. People have been sending us a lot of stuff about that, and that's that data is staff are aware of that data. The thing that we were wrestling with in prior years is the inability with the variables that we have to provide those services for everyone that is eligible, to in a fashion that actually provides service where we are not in particular disadvantaging students who are furthest from educational justice with bad service like 2-hour late times. And so optimizing for the portion of student outcomes that has to do with making sure they actually get to school on time. And then the other side of that being whether or not they can also have all get there within the same time frame. The other bit of data has to do with the need to the shift that I think Seattle should be really proud of. We're the only district, or sizable district in the state that does this, is that we have secondary going to school later, and there's abundant evidence about the need for secondary to not be going to school on time, that when they go to school in that 8 to 9 a.m. timeframe in particular, there's appreciable impact on their outcomes as students. And so that I think is something that what I'm hearing from staff is that there's a commitment to that, and also a commitment to other aspects of progress on reaching student outcomes in secondary, associated with having common start times across high schools so that they can maximize access to courses. And because they can use virtual offerings in order to make more coursework available to more students throughout the system, which I think is really a great thing to strive for. So then that leaves elementary, which is the big, I don't think there's a lot of debate about secondary.
Sorry, Director Hampson.
Yeah.
I'm gonna cut in here because we have a bunch of questions to get to, and we're trying.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So I'm gonna let.
I'm happy for you to skip me on future ones if you want to just have one director respond. I don't need to.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see how it goes. But I wanted to give Director Rivera
very broad question.
It is a broad question, but just trying to sort of see, like, from your board perspective, what are you looking for as you're trying to make these decisions or engage in these conversations with your fellow board members? So let
me just make one last statement. So I'm not making this decision, and I will be abstaining if bell times are presented to me, because it's a board decision. The transportation plan is a board decision. But I do want to make sure that the guardrail that we have, which is around engagement, has actually been fulfilled by staff. So, but that's kind of a separate conversation.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And Director Rivera-Smith.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great, thanks. Yes, I'm Director Lisa Rivera-Smith, your District 2 Director. I see lots of familiar names, so thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to go back to the question because I want to make sure that there was a lot of information just shared by my fellow directors, which was really good information, but I want to make sure I'm actually tackling the question. So can you repeat it, Erin?
Yeah, it's what are you considering as you're presented with this in your role as the board member in the conversation around 3-tiered bells and buses? Like, what questions or considerations, or what are you looking for in terms of the information that was assessed, researched, and maybe dismissed that led to this as the proposal forward to the board? And then also with that, how are you taking that information as you move forward in your role at the board as it continues through the board process?
Okay, yeah, that is a good question. So I was, as I think Director Sungwirth mentioned, I was looking for data. I was looking for a convincing argument that this proposal was the best thing for students. When this conversation began back even in, I think as far back as September, it was kind of framed as a budgetary concern and how we could cut money from the budget, and because we have a huge deficit overall, but a $17 million one in transportation alone. So it was kind of framed that way, and obviously all decisions we want to make should involve data and convincing data. We should come in critical to look for being convinced that it is the best decision for our students. So I think what's happened is it's become a bus driver issue being solved with a bell time answer, which I have not been convinced is the way to do it. especially considering that, again, we haven't been shown data to show that these bell times are in fact the best, safest, healthiest for our students. If we're going to be leaving the two-tier system we're currently in. We were not necessarily given that many options to choose from. It was at one time floated that to be between 3 tiers versus leaving the suspensions that we currently have suspended, which was presented, I think, at the second to last budget work session, not the one we just had yesterday. And that, to me, like as Director Songwell said, that was done keeping equity in mind. Those schools that have maintained suspensions are all tier 4 schools, which we rank our schools in tiers 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 being the most diverse, most students with more services, and 4 being a lot of the district 2 and district 4 schools that many of you are from too. And so you probably know that your schools have lost roots. And at the same time, some have gone online when we were able to. So what I'm looking for, to just get back to your question, what I'm looking for, I'm looking to be convinced again that what is the best and healthiest answer for our students, not what's the best financial decision, what's the best driver decision. Not that those aren't important and those all come into play, but ultimately I want us to make student-centered decisions. And to Director Hampson's point about, what's our board work and what's not, it's sort of both, right? This is an operational matter, but it is also a budgetary matter, which is our purview, because we do approve the budget. So I believe that it is something that we definitely should be weighing in on, and we have more than you know. And thank you everyone here and above, people who aren't here who have weighed in. I understand we've gotten thousands and thousands of responses to the Let's Talk link with comments and suggestions, and that's all very important. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that as we go on here, so I don't want to take up too much more time with this one.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I see questions in the chat, and just as a reminder, we're going to go through questions that were pulled off of registration, and if there's time at the end to pull some live questions, we will circle back to that. One of the things that we've heard from community a lot, and it was even in the presentations that Ashley Davies did throughout her different meetings in the last few weeks, is that one of their big concerns is for the morning child care that would be necessary for students in elementary school in particular who are at the later bell times. And one of the questions, many folks in the registration were asking, what do you think the role of the district is in how families should deal with this extra daycare need? And then a more direct question to that, and this is a bit operational, I haven't heard the answer to it, so I'm just wondering if any of you know, that currently the district does provide some busing to after school and maybe in this case before school care, and will that continue in the morning as well? So the question is around childcare and what is the role of the district, and will that busing that it has been available still be an option, and will that be extended to morning care? So I'll start with Director Rivera-Smith. I'm going to go the opposite direction.
I'm still unmuted. Look at that. So as far as what parents should do, considering before or after care, I look for it, right? I mean, hope that hasn't been figured out, right? This idea has been circulated with our childcare providers. They have been engaged with, and we have to define engagement, right? We're not going to do that tonight, but they have been met with, and they have had their concerns heard. There's no plans in place because even they have to kind of wait on the final decision of the board or final decision of the district. So there is talks already. They are aware that if this happens, they would have to be adjusting. Well, we want them to adjust for morning and after care as necessary. But yeah, that doesn't help you right now because that hasn't been planned. And so I understand there's a lot of anxiety about that. Repeat the second part of the question, Erin.
It's around the provided busing that's happening
Oh,
so
yeah.
far? Is that going to continue, and will it be?
That does happen right now, as many of you are aware. Some buses, and that's kind of been a weird thing, because it's actually been worked into routes, because generally speaking, it's not really our responsibility to give bus service to after school off-campus providers, but it does benefit us in a small portion, that it increases our ridership, and we are reimbursed on ridership. We're not reimbursed on number of buses. We're reimbursed on number of riders, number of routes or destinations, I should say. And what's the third one? Do my directors remember? There's a third one, but it's not on number.
Stops.
Sorry? Stops.
Stops.
Stops. Yeah. So it's not based on, again, it's not based on bus numbers themselves. So having extra riders to go to after school care has given us a little bit of a bump, but at the same time, it does require us, if it requires a whole nother bus, which means a whole nother driver, that becomes a problem. So some of that is provided right now. We don't know what next year is going to look like. Everything we have right now is based on, for lack of a better word, speculation. We're kind of just like what we think is going to happen. Routes have not been planned for next year yet. As far as I know, the bus provider has not been chosen yet. Unless someone has an update for me. But that's all to be seen. I mean, even the $5 million of savings, I have not seen the math on, but these are all estimates. These are all projections. So as far as what will be available for after school care, it's sort of to be determined. I'm sorry.
And since that was a more logistical question, Director Songwrites or Director Hampson, do you have any other information on that?
I want to share that I do want to give the district credit that they did have early conversation with the child care providers. Ashley Davies weeks ago did directly present to the child care providers to kind of understand the impact of this change. There was a second meeting with Chief of Partnerships James Bush and myself with the same child care provider group. I just happen to serve on a nonprofit board for a child care provider, and we've had direct conversations about how this might work for that particular nonprofit. So I don't know that I can give you a direct answer on what I think the role the district should play. I just wanted to share with you that among the earliest conversations that the district did have with child care providers and with building leaders or principals.
And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned real fast, and Director Hampson might build on this, that it is in our transportation service standards bus to after school care. It is written in there right now. It's a little bit of an equity issue because it also says to schools that can pay for it, and that's another topic maybe for another day. But yeah, I'll let her go on. I'm sure she has. Sure.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more thing, which is that it's my opinion that we could be trading labor issues. We're trying to address a bus driver labor shortage issue, but we also know that there is a significant childcare worker labor shortage, and I fear we're just trading labor issues. Of course, the school district is not directly responsible for addressing labor and childcare providers, but as a community member, this is something that I am considering.
So just to be clear, the model that is being proposed is very similar to what we had just a few years ago. My kids used to go to school at 9:40. And it was actually, in fact, what little data we have, which is limited and it's not finished data, it's not finished studies because it's just been too short of a time. Anytime you have a change, there's an impact. And so we actually, there's indications that the impact happens just because of the change, right? And so when we had the last change, there were negative impacts, but there were also a lot of other things happening, right, in the district. So we don't know, we can't necessarily attribute that, those negative things to the change in bell times to what we have now, right? But it was really difficult, I think for families at like my kids' school to go from 9:40 to 7:50 was a pretty major shift, right? So you can see how that would cause disruption. And I think disruption is, that's one of the things that I'm hearing from folks is, in addition to a lot of other stuff that is much of which is hyperbole, but the fundamental thing is that this change feels like, oh my God, this is a lot for us. It's for us as a family, for my students. And then when you add in the childcare factor, there's just so much that goes into that. And we do, I think one of the other directors said it, we're not responsible for the fact that we've learned one thing in the pandemic, it's we have to be really clear and stay really focused on what it is that our job is. And school districts are not intended to be the social service kind of pivot point for everything. And if we do allow that to happen, we lose sight of what our primary focus is, which is teaching and learning. So that said, that collaboration is really important. So it will kind of be going back to another model into the prior model with respect to childcare, which I think has pros and cons. It's a lot for them to ramp up to. It also, probably in some ways has benefits. But the labor, there's been some notes in the chat about that this isn't a real issue. And our superintendent and our deputy superintendent have years of experience at Metro. And so they're really familiar with both the labor agreements and the mechanisms that have allowed there to be these horrible shortages for bus drivers, not just here, but other places in the country, because we just can't compete. There's a whole other topic around how it is that we get paid, reimbursed by the state to provide transportation. And right now, no matter how many times we have added, we can't compete with Metro for a whole host of reasons. And one of the main ones actually is that it's the job itself. One of the things that we know from what that is actually a data point is the preference of being a Metro driver versus being a school bus driver. So there's that as well. It's a really, really tough job to do.
Okay, thanks for that. And we can go down that. There's a lot of questions extra questions that I saw in the chat that I have based off of what you said. I'm going to keep going through some of these because I think that they're important to get to. But there are lots of questions still about how it was determined that each school was put into the different tiers that they were put into. Some of which, like data points you all have referenced at different times. So like one of the data points that was brought up was what I'm calling, I don't know, this is how my brain is working, but the sleeping health of adolescents, needing to, go sleep later in the mornings. And so if we could just get a little bit clarity on your understanding of how those decisions were made, how the different schools ended up in the different tiers. And also what we're really hearing from community, and I'd like to hear from you all as a response, is there any flexibility in the final makeup of what that might look like, and what role does the community have in providing the feedback of where the schools land? So how did the schools land where they are, and what role can community have in that, if any, and possibly changing that or assessing that? And we're starting with Director Hampson.
Yeah, so I mean, I was heavily involved in the last bell time change. And as was Director Rankin, we were out there working with individual communities and supporting them and advocating for sometimes they swap times. I think it is absolutely appropriate for us to encourage folks to speak with their community and talk about, it's good information to know in a community amongst each other. People might have ideas about what they think is best for the overall school community. But if they haven't really engaged about it, they may not know the whole story. And so I think it's important to do that, and also to recognize that you're not some of the voices that you really need to hear from, you're probably not gonna hear. So to be conscientious about that, because they don't necessarily have capacity to engage. And I do want to be clear that one of the things that in terms of that sort of opt-out idea, or the fact that because our districts, the three of our districts are the lowest need. in terms of transportation, particularly from a socioeconomic standpoint. And most of the vast majority of the students that ride the bus are students of color and are low income. And the issue with that is that we still have, nothing's just 100%, right? And so when students are eligible, you still have to provide. Somebody mentioned something about 10 kids in a bus. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because they're eligible for transportation and we are required to provide them with transportation. And even if there's only a few of them that need it, right, when other people's kids or parents are driving them to school and whatnot. Yeah, I think that it is really good to communicate as a school and to talk to the principal and to the director of school and talk about what the impact's going to be and find ways to provide an overall, I think that it's important. I encourage that. I certainly would not discourage it.
So you're saying that the way to advocate in your school community is through your principal and the director of school for that school. Was that what I was hearing?
Yeah, as a starting point. I mean, you can, if you want to come together, because there's different pockets of need and it does help inform the system, right? But I want to be clear, this is a customer, this is something that the staff need to be responsive. And that's why I mentioned the thing about the community engagement, is that's one of our guardrails, is that the district do community engagement on major changes like this. And that's on them to make sure that they have in fact had two-way conversations with families about this, but particularly families furthest from educational justice who would be most likely to lose. And I do not have an answer for which schools ended up. I don't have a way to say this is why this school is 7:30 and this. We got some information, but we don't have all that information.
All right, thanks. Director Rivera-Smith, you
I can
look
tell
eager to
you
go.
why. I can tell you why. The answer, because I asked, and they said that it was based on efficiency to reduce number of drivers and keep high schools in the same tier. They were prioritizing adolescents for a later start, so they kept students in grades 6 through 12 in the second and third tiers.
Oh, yeah, that's not what I meant. I don't know why certain elementaries, we know why some.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was just answering the overall question. Yeah, sorry.
No, we know why the secondary ones that by the way, that's a whole task force. The task force that did that is actually going to weigh in on this. That's people from Children's Hospital, and they're going to send a letter and weigh in on this. And so they've been watching and they're paying attention. And so they're really interested in protecting that secondary piece of health. Health.
Can I just summarize? So for high schools, the rationale was they want all the high schools to be on one time. And that's the reason behind that is because they want to be able to offer more programming, online programming. So all the high schools are at one time. And they also need to respect the fact that the current agreement with Parks and Recs limits the end of the day for extracurricular activities is 5:45. That was the rationale. And we also know that there are adolescent sleep health benefits. So they were given the 8:30 start time. For the K through 8 schools, there is also a recognition that we have, adolescents in that group as well. That is the reason why they were given the 9:30 start time. In terms of like the individual schools, which elementary schools got 7:30 or 9:30, as Director Rivera-Smith mentioned, what was shared with us was that was around maximizing the route efficiency to reduce the overall number of bus drivers we need. One of the questions that I want to ask and I haven't had a chance to ask is, we've got a couple of schools that are interim sites, and eventually when construction is done, they will be returning to their permanent site. And so they are traveling to a longer distance to the interim site. And I'm wondering if there needs to be a conversation about what is the appropriate start time, and if there's any flexibility around that so that there's more time for them to arrive at school.
And I wanted to offer time for Director Songwritz and Director Rivera-Smith to answer the question as to if there are folks, particularly in this room, because these are folks who care a lot about this, if there are avenues for them to advocate for their own schools, what suggestions do you have for how to do that?
Go ahead, Vivian.
I think my advice would be to gather as a school community and really understand all the needs in that school community. And again, think about who may not be in that room when you're having that conversation and what their needs might be. And if you have a clear rationale for why your school prefers one time over the another time, I echo Director Hampson, have that conversation with your principal. Often the principal will be privy to other considerations, which can also shape that recommendation. And that would be the first starting point, I think.
As I've been trying to share, definitely go to the Let's Talk link that's available on the SPS website and our Facebook page, everywhere you look. That is the best place because that's where the staff are gathering the info together so they can kind of keep it on one place and disaggregate it. That is probably your best avenue for advocacy. Because right now, I think Director Congress also said earlier, it's not about swaying us. It's about swaying the staff, because ultimately, the board's role for right now is not a role. It was already out of committee, so at this point, it's in staff's hands. What it looks like when it comes back to us, then we re-enter it. But right now, it's in staff's hands. So if you're going to affect anybody right now, it needs to be them, not necessarily us. So please reach out to them with your concerns. But I think also, like Vivian was mentioning, you can speak for yourself. You really can't speak for your entire school, probably, unless you really are talking to everybody in your school. It's hard to know because I know, like, we've had some parents who have like the 9:30 start time who would rather prefer the 7:30 without maybe realizing what that means, implications for a bus riding student. That means they could be picked up on their bus at 6:15 in the morning, because a 7:30 start is a 7:15 drop off at school. According to our transportation service standards, they could be on the bus up to an hour, which means they could theoretically be picked up at 6:15 in the morning. That means they're waking up at 5:30, something like that, right? So there are really strong implications for that. So as much as you might prefer that earlier start, that is detrimental to some students, I feel, my opinion, right? And probably other people's. So it's hard to say, it's hard for anybody to speak for their entire community. It's definitely hard for us to speak for all of you, right? Because I know there's different opinions out there. And I would prefer you speak for yourself and definitely send it into the Let's Talk. If you want to, you can email the superintendent and staff directly. But again, that is your best avenue right now for advocacy.
Okay. And I put the link for folks to find the director of school for your school in the chat. And we might be able to put that in a couple more times if the chat's going by really quickly. Sort of on this same line of thinking, the question of whether or not schools can solve for their own issue and then opt out of any bell time changes has come up, and I haven't seen that addressed in anything specifically yet. I think it's a pretty simple answer, but if you know the answer for that, if this is moving forward, can schools sort of self-solve? Director Songritz, I think we're back to you.
I don't officially know the answer to this question, but my instinct would be no. But I don't know for sure. And I don't know why the answer would be no. I don't, other directors weigh in.
Director Hampson, I saw you shaking your head.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of stuck in the middle here. The Brady Bunch middle, yeah, so I mean, it's because in that school you'd have to have 100%, otherwise you still have to provide a bus because kids are eligible for transportation. We have to provide transportation for kids, and somebody was stating, what it's working now. Well, we have suspended routes. That's why it's working now, and yet so we're not currently we're out of compliance with our own transportation standards by not providing transportation to those that are eligible in our transportation standards. I would like to have a harder conversation, which every time I try to have that conversation, we also have another blow up about who all is eligible for transportation. And that may not, depending, I think we need to look at that more seriously so that we can kind of cut down on the number of students that are eligible for transportation in the most equitable way possible to maximize the service and not be getting kids to school 2 hours late. So that's the other part of that, is that we're getting to school 2 hours late, and that's also not acceptable. So it's a tough equation, but yeah, I love the idea of an opt-in model. I've been told that those numbers don't crunch in terms of actually having any appreciable impact on the number of routes, right, that we would still have to run, because you would still have to provide service to those people, those families who qualified and wanted it.
Thanks. Director Smith, did you have anything to add to that one?
Well, I forget the question, but to build off of what Director Thompson was just saying there, I know I personally, at least, and I'm sure the directors did ask about exploring William Bell times, which is kind of what that sounds like, this idea of a school starting differently so that another route can fold into it. And yeah, I was told it would not save enough buses, which, again, I don't have the data. I just know that's what I've been told. And yeah, I hope is somewhere. And maybe alone it wouldn't, but I would definitely love us to explore a mix of solutions, to try to solve this. But repeat the question there, Erin. I wanted to make sure I get back to that.
If a school solves its busing for their own students, can they opt out?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. You know what? I think that's very difficult to say, because again, you do have to account for all the students in your school, and they are still, by our policy, by our transportation service standards, entitled to bus service. So unless that changed, that would be a huge exception to make for a school. And it's also, that's great for your school, but what about all the other schools? And as a district, we need to think system wide. We can't just, make sure individual schools have it good while the system itself is suffering, which again is why this is a big decision, because this is a system wide decision we're trying to make here. And we need to make sure that that's done according to our values, which we have put into writing. We have our goals and our guardrails. Number one guardrail of which is to engage with students and families furthest from educational justice before any initiatives go forward. Also says using best practices, which I don't know if that's been defined, but either way, we do need that engagement to happen. I don't know that happened before this proposal was put forward to us. It doesn't sound like it was, which I think is the problem. A lot of things, it sounds like there's going to be a children's paper or study coming to us, or opinion. That would have been great to have before they made the suggestions, because all of this stuff should have kind of been hashed out before it's given a proposed plan to us. It's kind of working a little backwards right now, and that's very frustrating and very causing the anxiety we have now with families. So I think I answered the question. I don't want to go on too much longer because I know we want to get more in.
Okay, and just as a heads up to council folks monitoring the chat, I think we're going to be able to pull one or two questions. So if there's something that's coming up quite frequently, can you take a minute to look at that while I ask this next question? Sorry, logistical things happening as we're doing this too. So as you may have noticed, I'm into multi-part questions, so this too is going to be a multi-part question. But there's a question just about what the board, Director Hampson sort of started to speak to this, but what the board role is in this process. And then if you could include the timeline, which I kind of have, I think, if you don't, but the timeline for what the process looks like at this point. And what happens if the board votes no? So these are logistical, very specific to the board process, or this process as it is in the board at the moment. So what's the board role in this process? What is that? What are the dates? What's the timeline for that? And what happens if it doesn't move, if the board votes no? And We're on, oh man, I have lost track of how we're starting this. I think we're on Director Rivera-Smith again.
Okay, so the board's rule historically has been that we approve the transportation service standards, in which the bell times have sort of lived as an appendix. And that's kind of the way we've done it, right? And that's the way it was presented to us a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I've lost track, but that was presented to our operations committee, of which I am the chair, along with our members, our Dr. Songmoritz and Dr. Michelle Sarju. That is the process we followed every year. Only when obviously bell times are changing is probably much to say about bell times, and it doesn't happen very often, but it's happening right now. This is a suggestion that came forward. We were in a position of deciding what to do with that, because again, when it came to us in documentation, there was no data. It was sort of like, here's a suggestion, yes or no. I did not feel good about making that decision without any data to go on. We had a lot of other board members in the room who had the opinion that this should not be decided by the board, because it is a very operational matter, which I'm not arguing with. But again, it became, we even had legal in the room tell us like, well, you've kind of done it in practice, but by policy, it's not specific that you decide bell times. It is specific that we decide transportation standards, but there's nothing in policy defining transportation standards. It just says may contain XYZ. So it's sort of this odd area where we're in this transition to the student outcomes focused governance, where we focus on the 3 goals and the guardrails, and all other operational matters sort of leave our purview. But honestly, we're not there yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. And this one did come to us inside the transportation service standards. We had that. Again, it was a long conversation. Ultimately, we decided as a committee to move it forward for consideration. I know that doesn't mean much to people outside of the room, but that is not an approval. We don't approve things in committee. We move them forward either with a suggestion for consideration or a suggestion for approval. We did not move it forward with a suggestion for approval. We moved it forward with a suggestion for consideration, because I wanted to respect, and this is my opinion why I made that vote. I wanted to respect that this is a process that has to move forward, that staff, I believe, have put a lot of time and effort into this. They didn't show us the data for that, but I believe it's there and I want to see it. But at the same time, again, I wanted to keep this conversation going. So that was one of the hardest votes I think I've ever made as a board member. But it's kept the conversation going, and it's given you guys a chance to weigh in on it, because I think that if we had just sent it back and said, hey, you know what, no good, take it away, I think it would have kept, I think the outcome would have been the same. The staff would have continued forward with this transportation, with this bell time plan, because we didn't, we don't really kill things in there again. We just say, we could have just, like I said, punted it. I think that it might have still moved forward, but people would have thought we killed it. So there wouldn't have been much conversation happening. You guys wouldn't have been sort of had your ears perked that, hey, we should be paying attention and speaking up on this, because it would have looked like it was over and done, but it wouldn't have been. So as much as it's been very hard for people to have to worry about this, it is something we need to think about and speak up on. And I'm proud of everybody who has done that so far. And where we are now, again, is that it is going to be coming back to us for introduction at a regular board meeting. I believe that'll be our next week, right? Our May 4th meeting, and that's for introduction. That means they're going to bring it back to us. It might look exactly the same. It might look very different. That has yet to be seen. I'm convinced it's going to have some changes. So I know that Superintendent Jones and staff are generally hearing the feedback, and they are generally weighing their options. So I believe it'll have some sort of changes or some sort of updates to it. I can't at all say what that's going to be, but we'll see what it is. On May 4th, we'll see. That'll be introduction. That means we all hear about it. We get to discuss it. And if it goes along the timeline of everything else, 2 weeks later, we'd vote on it. And that would make it the May 18th board meeting. And that's sort of the final stop of it. things can happen between now and then, but that is the sort of basic timeline.
Thanks. And then Director Songritz, because I'm going that direction now. Do you know what happens if the board votes no?
If the board votes no, we just keep our current transportation standards, and the current bell times are in the current transportation service standards. I want to build on the conversation we're having about the board decision, and kind of, because I was in that operations committee meeting and I did vote to move it forward to the board. My perspective on this is that at this moment in time, it is firmly a board decision. I recognize that this is a operations decision, but I think it's important to separate conversations we're having about what should lie in the purview of the board and what should lie in the purview of district leadership as a broader conversation, and have ample conversation time for that. So at this moment in time, we are in a moment of transition. At this exact moment, this is still a board decision. And I think that's one piece of it. The second piece of this is that I see this as a system-wide decision. This is not like what color should we paint this building, or even what principal should be the principal of this school. This is a decision that impacts every member of the Seattle Public Schools community. And if the board doesn't technically make a decision, the board should absolutely be consulted. And so that's one perspective I have on this. And finally, just my role as a board director is to set expectations for the kind of leadership that I think our district leaders should have. And my personal expectation is that we make data-oriented decisions. And to date, I really believe they have done a lot of hard work on this. They have really tried to find the best solution for addressing the bus driver shortage issue. I think that solution needs to be taken into the context of all the other moving parts of our district, which I think is board should have input on. And I am concerned when I haven't seen the math behind where we get there. You know, people have asked questions about why can't we pay our bus drivers more? Well, we actually are planning to pay our bus drivers more this fall. That is actually happening. I am curious if we waited this fall with the highest starting wage in our region, something that is competitive with Metro, competitive with neighboring districts, which we were not before, if that would improve our ability to recruit new drivers to drive our children to school. I would like for us to not to rush this decision without making sure we have done really thorough analysis. That is my role as a director from my perspective.
And Director Hanson, I want to give you a chance to participate in this answer as well, but also noting that we're running out of time very quickly.
So as board directors, we're responsible for representing the vision and values of community and holding the superintendent accountable to producing outcomes, creating the conditions so that students achieve the outcomes that we have said as a board are what we expect of them. Are students able to read? Are they able to do math? Are they prepared for career, college, and community? We are not managers. We are paid. We are volunteers, right? We get a nominal amount of money as elected officials to do this role. We don't have qualifications to do the job that the staff that are charged with doing this work are actually paid to do and held accountable to doing. So I fundamentally disagree. First of all, I fundamentally disagree that we were not presented data, because we were presented data. I think when you put us in the position, which I believe staff inappropriately did, and the board has overreached in prior years, of taking over a management decision, which is not our choice, our decision, then yes, you were put in the position of all of a sudden needing to get massive amounts of additional data if you in fact are the one making that decision. What we need to be asking is to our superintendent is, can you confirm for us This isn't completely different from what my fellow directors are saying, but can you confirm for us that this is on a whole going to produce, because they're the ones that have to be held accountable for whether or not students are actually going to fare better over time, because our goals are pretty substantive in terms of reading, math, college, and career as a result of making this change. And if they can answer those questions to our satisfaction, then, you know, all is well. But it isn't our decision to make. And I don't believe legally it's our decision to make. My understanding right now, if, as I said, if for some reason, as I've told staff that this was presented and it, as part of the transportation service standards, I would be abstaining because I'm not going to take on managerial decisions. That's overreach. And I'm not qualified. I haven't spent the entire year looking at transportation issues all day, every day. And therefore, I'm not qualified and I wasn't hired to do that job. I think these are inputs into the system, right? And we need to look at every single best practice model that you can look at would tell us that this is beyond the scope of what the board should do. There are a lot of important questions that we're all responsible for asking. We have a really important guardrail, as has been brought up, around whether or not, in particular, families furthest from educational justice were engaged about the impact of this. It was admittedly not, somebody mentioned this, their engagement should have started back in January about this, right? No question. So there's, you know, it's a both and kind of situation. Lots of data has been presented to us. We actually have gotten data about, as I mentioned before, about even with the same payment and benefits with as Metro drivers, it's still not as desirable a job. And I just would, somebody, you know, well, why isn't, well, I mean, get on a school bus full of middle schoolers and you might have some idea. It is a really tough job and we are not alone in struggling with this. So there are definitely a lot of really difficult moving pieces, and that doesn't change the impact that it has on families.
Right.
That I think is what we need to be attentive to with you all, is what is the impact and has that impact been clearly investigated and interrogated by staff? And that's what we need to hold them accountable to. That's really kind of my focus.
So I appreciate you all taking the time this evening. We are over time. We had an hour planned for this. There are a lot of questions that have come in. I want the audience to know that we have collected those questions. We also have the questions from the registration, and I plan on forwarding them to the district so that they're there and available at least. And any responses that we get, we'll try and make sure that we're the conduit and circling back and making sure that that information is available. From what we've heard from community overall and what I'm seeing in the chat here as well, and is that there is just this really a curiosity around like why this rush feeling to it? Why hasn't this been played out over the course of time? And also a deep desire to feel heard from community, and I don't think community is feeling very heard at the moment. And I think that is something that falls, I'm going to speak for myself and from council also, that falls on all of us, the district, the board, council. We're all here, and like other community members, community-based organizations, we're all here to bring forward that space to allow community to have the information, to be informed, to feel part of that process. So moving forward, I would really encourage all of us and community to hold us accountable to that as well, to really look at what does this engagement mean, and are we really truly digging into that? So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to again acknowledge that this is a really difficult transition for folks. There were lots of questions we did not get to, and we'll be passing those forward and trying to be a conduit of information for folks as well. So thank you all for being here this evening. Appreciate it. and hope that you have a good rest of your evening.